Greetings and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Rose Mason and our guest today is Alex Lopes. Alex holds an MS from the University of Sao Paulo and a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. After working as a business analyst, Alex has held a number of academic positions. Most recently, he has worked at the University of Cincinnati's College of Business, and he is currently at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University in the Operation and Decision Technologies Department. Today, Alex will speak about how the 2014 World Cup and the preparations for the 2016 Summer Olympics have affected Brazil's economy and infrastructure. Alex, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To begin with, could you give us a brief overview of what's been happening with Brazil's economy over the past few years?
Yes, so that is a tale of two different moments, right? The first takes place between 2006 and 2010. We had very strong growth, about 4.5% every year. The economy was going really well. Brazil survived the world financial crisis somewhat untouched, right? Very solid financial fundamentals, and then things kind of turned to the worst, right? So in 2011 to 2013, GDP really started declining for an average growth of about 2%. Fiscal fundamentals started to really go downhill. And the inflation, which is always a big concern for Brazil because we survived kind of hyperinflation back in the early 90s, it starts to creep up again. So they have a ceiling of, the expectations that the inflation is going to be about 4.5% per year, between 6.5% and 2.5%. That's the range. And it started going higher and higher in that range. So if you look at 2014, which is the day of the World Cup, then things really started to really take a even turn for the worse. And doing some research for our talk, Rose, the current indicators are not very positive, right? In 2014, actually, we did have negative GDP, only 0.1%, but still in the negative states. Inflation very, very high in the upper limit, and industrial production in the country actually fell during the World Cup, 1.9%. So those are actually data from friends of mine in Brazil, Marcelo Moura, which is a faculty at IBMEC there. And the prediction for 2015 is that inflation is actually going above the range to 7%, and there will be either zero growth or a slight decline in growth again. So with the interest rates actually reaching now at 12.5% per year, the base interest rate for Brazil. So the economy was really going well in the second half of the 2006-2010, has really taken a kind of somewhat of a dive in the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Could you speak to the worldwide scrutiny over Brazil's economy and infrastructure during Brazil's preparations for the 2014 World Cup, and what were the causes?
Yeah, sure. What we had there is that as the bids were in place for the World Cup and the Olympics, right? I mean, that's when Brazil was going a very positive trajectory. So we had a very popular president with Lula, right? That was so it was a call in terms of having Brazil reaching its proper place in the world, stage. The World Cup and the Olympics were sold to the Brazilians as an opportunity to improve infrastructure, right? And with a lot of support from private investment, right? In reality, what happened is that once the economy is starting to take a downturn, we saw more and more the government pumping money into the World Cup infrastructure instead of having the massive private investment. We really saw the government taking a lot of the responsibility, the vast majority of the responsibility in financing the World Cup, the infrastructure, right? So we had, if you add to this, the constant presence of corruption, which is unfortunately something that still exists quite a bit in Brazil, and some very expensive stadiums. For example, the Brazilian stadium is going to actually cost about $1 billion. For a country, that is not super rich, that's a big investment. And by the way, Brazil has no team in the first division of the National League or the second division of the National League. So they're in the third division of the National League right now. So it was easy to understand why things really escalated in the Confederations Cup, right? I was there in the Confederations Cup. I saw several of the protests that were taking place there, and they were highly justifiable, right? Because you see all this money being invested where the conditions for the infrastructure were not hospitals, right, or education, were not really apparently not really being put in the forefront, right? So that's attracted a lot of big eyes in Brazil, because like we're 1 year away from the World Cup, and there is these massive protests. And does Brazil want the World Cup after all, right? Yeah. And at that point, I'm not really sure if the answer was yes or no. Okay, over time, that was actually a good thing in the end, because I think that called a lot of attention to the things that are very important for the population. But it was easy to see how much scrutiny caused, because the infrastructure was not really advancing in the way that was expected to advance at that particular point. And there's a lot of concern about the electricity and power systems in Brazil, airports, right? Just basic transportation within the cities. So nobody knew for sure if the World Cup would work well or not, or how it is going to be perceived, or if it's going to give any positive outcomes for the country at that particular point.
Okay, thank you for explaining all of that. I didn't know a lot of that. All right. So was the World Cup a good investment for Brazil, given the billions that were spent?
That is an amazing question, because it's so hard to answer, right? It depends a lot on the perspective that you are taking, right? So the estimates that I was able to research indicate that it was about an investment of $11 billion for the World Cup, with $2 billion extra just for security, right? So it's a lot of money, right? It's really a lot of money. In comparison to previous World Cups, right, I mean, it was significant more, right? Part of it was the idea to really extend the reach of the stadiums, right? So usually FIFA would probably have, 8 whole cities. In Brazil, we have more than that, right? And it was a way to partly to take the World Cup to different parts of the country, part to get some political favor as well, okay? So the overall expectations in that is that we'll probably kind of broke even in the short term, right, in terms of getting some return because of tourism. The assessments after the World Cup, in particular, they are, if you look at the government reports, they are going to emphasize a lot of the tourism, right? How many people came to Brazil, the amount of expenses, etc., right? If you go a little bit deeper, however, then you see other factors. For example, one of the biggest concerns during the World Cup was air traffic, right? Because airports in Brazil have been really not being very there's not been much investment for airports. So everybody was afraid, that would be like massive air chaos, right? Everybody in big lines in the airports, etc. What happened instead is that there was a lot of holidays in Brazil during the World Cup. So whenever you have a team, even if it's not Brazil playing in your whole city, everybody would not work. Actually, it was just a holiday because of traffic concerns. So fewer people in the traffic, right? So people can circulate a little bit better. Schools also moved. So the school year was adjusted because of the World Cup, right? So if you look at this, then you see that while we brought lots of tourists to Brazil, on the other hand, the overall production in the country, right, business kind of pretty much stopped during that period, right? So if you look about, some statistics in terms of, there was even a decline in air traffic. So that's one of the reasons that the airports worked so well, because fewer people that were doing business were traveling during that period, so the flights actually went, on time, and we did not face many issues on that. So if you look at a good investment, that's a very tough question to answer. In the short term, probably it balanced out a little bit. In the long term, right, that's when you see perhaps a little bit more of an optimistic perspective, in the sense of there were some public works that probably without the World Cup would not be in place. Like, we have significant improvements in the airports, and there was some improvement in the transportation infrastructure in general. The downside of that is that some of the major construction projects did not finish on time. And now that the World Cup is over, there is not that much motivation to actually finish them in a way that can actually benefit the population, right? So, it's a hard balance. And so, it's still, I think even Brazil, most Brazilians right now are probably going to have some ambiguity in how to answer that question.
Okay. Well, thank you for breaking that out into the short and long term. I think that really helps answer that question a lot better. All right. So what effects on Brazil's economy have you noticed during the preparations for the 2016 Summer Olympics?
That is a little bit, so the thing with Olympics is the big difference between the World Cup is the World Cup is spread all over the country, right? In Brazil, even too much at times. There's too much separation when you have like games in Manaus, which is the middle of the rainforest, or in Cuiabá, great places, but a little bit more distance from the rest of the population, which is mostly in the coast. Rio is more concentrated, right? So Rio is a single city, and I think that you are not going to see that much of a widespread ripple effect in terms of economics, for the good or for the bad from Rio, partly because a lot of the investment took place for the World Cup. Since the final game and everything was in Rio in Maracanã, there is still anticipated $2 billion in additional investment for Rio, especially in transportation. I had a chance 3 years ago to visit the the local organizing committee for the Olympics in Rio. And one thing I noticed is that the plans were very sensible, right? So they are not investing too heavily in big hotels, right? Or things that will probably not be used after the World Cup. They're trying to really maximize as much as possible. They wanted to invest a lot in simple transportation solutions like, rapid bus lanes, right? And I thought it was very sensible in that regard. Now, of course, some of the preparation has been late, right? As expected, I guess, in Brazil at times. So they have a very tight deadline. And this tight deadline is a big concern because that's an opportunity for the costs to escalate a little bit more because it becomes very urgent and there's a little bit less control because we just have to get it done for the Olympics.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. So do you think that hosting such large and global events are worth it for Brazil or any country for that matter?
Oh, gosh, that's another tough question. Rose, you have really tough questions. For FIFA and the IOC, certainly it was, right? I mean, if you have a look at FIFA, which is an interesting organization to say the least, they got billions of dollars in revenue, all completely tax-free, because FIFA is a non-profit organization. They got some tax arrangements. So Brazil lost, according to The Guardian, about $250 million in tax revenue from FIFA by itself, right? For others, it depends, right? I think the best way to answer this is look at what the country is trying to accomplish, right? If you are a rich country, if you are, London 2012, right? Different situation, rich country, providing a good venue for London, right? If you look back in China, kind of occupying center stage in 2008, right? So the objective in Brazil was pretty much to take this stage, right? To announce our arrival to the world stage. So if you look at where the main competitions have taken place in Russia, right, in Brazil, in China, right, in South Africa, right? So those are the BRICS countries, and kind of, hey, we have arrived, right? So that perspective was very interesting. I think that the best example of, I guess, a city that really did the most of the opportunity is probably Barcelona. So I have a good friend, Ana Carla Reis. She does consulting for urban planning in creative cities in Brazil, and she provided me some material about how Barcelona was very effectively transformed for the Olympics in 1992. Increased tenfold in tourism investment, right? So, I think it depends a lot on trying to accomplish. There was an article before the World Cup saying that Brazil might be the last democracy to host a World Cup. And if you look at how things went, now we have Russia in 2018, we have Qatar in 2022, because there's a lot of scrutiny. So if from the perspective of Brazil, one of the great things that happened was this call for citizenship, right? Was a completely unintended consequence. But the popular movement, right, the popular protests that took place, that was something that was unanticipated, but very positive to Brazil. So I think that the big issue is, what are we trying to achieve, right? For a developing country, it's a very risky proposition, especially in the short term, but there might be some good benefits in the long term. As long as you know how to manage that, as long as you make the process very participative, as they did in Barcelona, and as they're trying to do a little bit in Rio as well. So, we hope for the best, I suppose.
Okay, great, thank you. It really seems you have to look at it from a certain perspective to really figure out the answer.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex, for speaking with us today. And that's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.